we like to thumb our nose at the Poms, but in fact we still maintain lots of the trappings of a colonial society. We idealise the bush, but we live in the city. Now, how does Rudd manage to deal with those sorts of contradictions?
Well, I think he does it by suggesting that they're not really contradictions at all. They're just part of the glorious Australian complexity. and that, okay, there's nothing wrong with admiring certain things about our British tradition, as long as we don't feel absolutely bound by it and part of a cultural cringe which happens whenever some Pom tells us we're not behaving ourselves. Okay, we live in cities, but we do love the bush. We want to live in houses with gardens. We don't want to live in apartments and flats. We want to, we pay the idea of open space, the idea of pioneering, the idea of frontiers. These are things that deeply appeal to Australians, and they appeal to city-dwelling Australians just as much. That's why we all buy four-wheel drive cars, even if we never use them. And I think, sorry, what was the other one you mentioned?
Well, the city and the bush. No, I think that was the three. The idea that we're larrikins when in fact we're very law-abiding.
Yes, well, that's true too. Of course, we do like to think of ourselves as larrikins. We like to think of ourselves as mavericks. We have no great respect for hidebound authority and pomposity and so on. That's fine, but we've still got to be polite to each other. And that, again, is one of the things where Rudd is able to resolve this terrible idea, which Howard despised what he called political correctness, which in fact was simply being polite. But Rudd is able to reconcile the idea of a decent law-abiding society with the idea that you can be a bit outrageous, that you can think outside the square, that you can move in different directions from time to time. He himself swears vigorously at his staff. Okay, that's the larrikin part, but he'd never dream of swearing in church. That's the politically correct part, if you like. And Rudd makes us see that there's no contradiction in this. We don't have to choose between, being absolutely outrageous larrikins and total goody-goodies. They're both part of the Australian character.
And what about the God-bothering? Where does that
Well,
fit?
We're not comfortable with the God-bothering, let's face it. Australians aren't great God-botherers and never have been. And I think that is possibly one of the things that disturbs us a bit still about Kevin Rudd, that he does parade his religiosity, for want of a better word, in a way that is a little bit un-Australian. But on the other hand, there's also a reassurance in it. There is, Kevin Rudd is a believer. He has principles. He holds to certain ideals. Now, they may not always be very sensible ideals in some people's view, but it is part of this thing that he can be relied on. He can be trusted. And that's the whole essence of the appeal of Kevin Rudd, that he is trustworthy. And that, incidentally, is why it was so damaging a couple of weeks ago when he went on record as denying the obvious, kept saying that the Tamil asylum seekers on the Oceanic Viking weren't getting special treatment. They quite clearly were getting special treatment, and he should have simply said, okay, but in the circumstances there's no alternative. But he kept denying it and denying it and denying it. And I think that was a huge political mistake on his part, because it made him seem not only slightly insane, but also that suddenly, okay, he is indulging in that doublespeak that none of us like in politicians, and that we didn't think he was doing.
I reckon, I wonder if the Oceanic Viking event doesn't raise other questions about Kevin Rudd. You talked about him being a man of integrity, a man of principles. You also say that in his second term he will make the tough decisions. You suggest he will. Now, I wonder why did Kevin Rudd send those people back to Indonesia after they've been rescued by an Australian customs vessel. It was, media-wise, it was a disaster. Instead of everyone forgetting about it after instead of everyone forgetting about it after a day, we had 3 weeks of headlines. B, in terms of relations with Indonesia, it was a disaster. He had to deal with the president, but from every official from the president down was outraged and angry about it, and it did a great deal of damage to Australia's long-term cooperation on this issue with Indonesia. And C, it didn't seem to fit with his principles. If as a God-bothering, Bornhofer admiring man.
Well, I think you've got to go back a little bit about this. I mean, Rudd did decide that he was going to declare war on people smugglers. It was his idea of border protection. And then he tried to come to an arrangement with the Indonesians, which appeared at one stage at least to be working. And then I suppose, it was pushed too far. I mean, I don't know exactly whose decision it was to send the Oceanic Viking back to Indonesia, but obviously when it was made, it was believed that the Indonesians would accept it. It was wrong. Yeah. Again, there is the asylum seekers issue is a very, very difficult and dicey one with Australians. It always has been. I mean, I don't know why. It's a function of us being girt by sea, perhaps. But we are deeply suspicious of boat people. And one of the reasons I suspect is that we were boat people ourselves. We arrived by boat, we dispossessed the inhabitants of the country. Shit, maybe somebody else was going to do that to us too. And I think there's something buried in the Australian consciousness, and it's very difficult for any Prime Minister to contain it. Certainly, the way that whole Oceanic Viking issue unfolded was a disaster at almost every level. But I still think that it was part of that Rudd was seeking an accommodation somewhere where we could get a system of dealing with the boats that could actually be coherent, that could involve the places they were coming from as well as the places they were going to, and that would not simply be a signal to an open door policy, which, whether it's good or bad in terms of moral issues or whatever, is simply not a policy which would be saleable to the Australian electorate. And it is a very, very difficult issue, and Prime Ministers and leaders of the opposition and Labor leaders have been trying to work out a system which works for a very long time, in which the moral component and the political component can somehow be made to mesh. Nobody's found that solution yet. Rudd's still looking for it, and good luck to him, but I don't think he's getting very close to it so far.
I mean, I agree with you that Rudd has to act, any government has to act, and the idea of cooperation with Indonesia is clearly the way to go. And in fact, as I said in the question before, I think he undermined that by not simply saying, look, we'll do our share, we'll take the Oceanic Viking. I mean, remember, Indonesia had just taken another boat back into port, Merak Port. But, I mean, you didn't mention their domestic opinion in that response. Now, it seemed to me that Rudd had an eye. He was getting... The opposition was attacking the government for being soft on borders. He didn't want... he wanted to be seen to be tough. Wasn't that what was driving it? Really?
Yes, but it's also, again, going back to his pre-election promises, that he did say he would be tough on border protection, that he would take on people smugglers. He said he would dismantle the Pacific solution and the hellhole at Nauru, which he did. He said he'd abolish the temporary protection visas, which were one of the cruelest inventions of the Howard government, and he did. He said he'd attempt at every level to get the detainees processed quickly and not have them hanging around for months and even years, which he has. He has said that he would get detainees released into the community as far as possible and avoid keeping them behind razor wire, which he has. I mean, there has been a lot of movement.
Oh, sure. No, I guess my point was not to criticise the things he's done, but again, to ask, but
yes.
Isn't he worried about, I mean, you know, we began this conversation with to what extent Rudd is poll-driven and successful at SPID, and whether that was a factor in his decision on that particular vote. I don't want to...
Well, I mean, you can never leave politics out of any situation, and obviously it was a factor. I mean, what you've just said, I think, is one of the reactions that a lot of us have had about Rudd. We think what he has done, most of what he's done has been admirable, but we don't think he's done enough of it. And I think this is where the second term thing comes in, that Rudd has not been able, for various reasons, one of which was, of course, the global financial crisis, to make his first term as spectacular and as productive as he would have liked. But he has always been in it for the long haul, and I think, I hope, certainly, that once we get round the corner of the next election and he doesn't feel he's bound by all those promises he had to make, or he felt he had to make in 2007, that you will see much more progress. I do believe, as I say, that Rudd has got the fire in his belly and that he's not simply, a politician who's in it for the glory of being on top.
Overall, as I say, you've argued that Kevin Rudd has managed to connect with the Australian psyche, with our deeper psychology, our myths and traditions. And we've talked about mateship and the fair go and those sorts of things. It's a very blokey set of traditions. And I wonder if we look forward into the future and Kevin Rudd has gone off to become UN Secretary General, as we will expect him to do at some point. Given his great success.
At about the time Malcolm Turnbull becomes Pope.
But whatever the case, his nominated successor, Julia Gillard, is now, taking over mid-term. Could she connect in the same way that Rudd has done on these traditions, or is this a very...
Yes, I think she could, and I think that's an interesting point. That one of the things that Rudd has managed to do in a way that, as in my lifetime anyway, has been quite unprecedented, has been to unite the various factions of the Labor Party into a coherent working administration. I mean, it just hasn't happened in the past. The idea that Rudd and Gillard, the right and the left, and different in so many other ways, could get into this partnership situation, it was just inconceivable a few years ago. And yet Rudd is now running a very, very successful government. I would say that the Rudd cabinet is probably not as good as Bob Hawke's first cabinet, but that's about the only one in contemporary history I'd put ahead of it. It really is an extraordinarily effective government. And this, I don't know whether one gives Rudd all the credit for this, but he has certainly ensured that the themes of this government are now thoroughly embedded in his successor, whoever it is. And of course, the likelihood is it will be Julia Gillard. And that all those dreadful arguments, if you like, which we've seen in the Liberal Party are most unlikely to happen in the future in the Labor Party. They've learned it over a long, hard time, but the lesson does seem to have come through.
All right. I'm going to open up the floor to questions now. If you'd like to ask a question, just speak up, raise your hand and then speak up, and I'll repeat it so everyone can hear. Who wants to get the ball rolling? Please.
Mungo, do you think there'll be a double dissolution, and when would you expect all of that?
Okay, will there be a double dissolution, and if so, when?
Well, assuming the Senate doesn't pass the emissions trading bill this time, assuming it does duck shove it off, the cause is there, and Rudd has a very good argument for it. I mean, Rudd has always said he doesn't want a double dissolution, he doesn't want an early election, but it is absolutely vital to get the legislation through. Now, the Libs have now welched thoroughly on the deal to get the legislation through this time. There's no reason to believe they'll be any more successful in delivering the goods next time. So Rudd has a good political case, I think, for going to an early election. He'd rather not, but the political case is there.
Why would he rather not?
He'd rather not because he doesn't believe in disrupting the term. He doesn't want to fight an election campaign. He wants to get on with governing. And particularly at this time, if there is to be a double dissolution, I don't think it'll be till the second half of next year. This is for various technical reasons, because it disrupts the Senate timetable. It would mean having a half-Senate election at the beginning of 2012, which you don't want, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But if Rudd does succumb to the idea, I think that he certainly has the political justification for doing so, the policy justification, because, as I say, it would appear in the present state of the Liberal Party and the opposition and the Senate that the only way you're going to get an emissions trading scheme through is through a double dissolution. And Rudd's been totally consistent about that. I think he'll be thinking long and hard about it, and I doubt if he'll make a decision until Parliament comes back. But, and as I say, I think if he does go, the urgency that Copenhagen produced is not going to be there, obviously. If he does go, he would rather put it off till the second half of next year, when it's closer to a legitimate election and when it won't disrupt the Senate timetable. And I think that, that then it is likely that, assuming the election's in the second half of next year, it's likely that it will be a double dissolution, yes.
Is he worried about how a double dissolution would benefit minor parties, particularly the Greens? Because it lowers the threshold.
Well, it lowers the threshold. I mean, it depends who you listen to on this. I mean, I've done my figures on it, and I think it would benefit Labor more than anybody else. And even if it benefits the Greens, I think that while the Greens can be difficult, they're a lot less difficult than people like Fielding and Xenophon, and I think that would be an appealing thought to Rudd. And obviously he would rather have a majority in his own right, and obviously he'll be getting various kinds of advice about this. I mean, let me give you a bit of history about this. The present proportional representation system in the Senate, sorry, I don't know why I said that. The proportional representation system in the Senate was introduced by the Chifley government, and it was introduced because Bert Everett, one of the great Australian politicians, but unfortunately somebody who wasn't very good at maths, once went into Chif's office and said, look, I've done my sums on this. If we now introduce proportional representation into the Senate, we'll never lose control of it. And we can do it because we've got the numbers in the Senate and the reps at the moment. We don't need a constitutional amendment. We can just do it by law. So Chif said, yeah, that's a good idea, and brought it in, and Labor has never looked like having control of the Senate since.
Okay, question there, yes?
Any idea who the informal vote was in the second ballot?
No idea.
Any idea who the informal vote was in the second ballot for the Liberal leadership?
I don't know, but I like to think it was Wilson Tuckey.
Yeah.
Maxine McCallum was the star of the election campaign. What's her future?
What's the future of Maxine McCallum?
Oh, well, I think Maxine McCallum will certainly be elevated to the ministry after the next election. She's served her apprenticeship as a parliamentary secretary. Obviously, that electorate is not secure yet, and she's got to spend a lot of time continuing to work in Bennelong. But I would expect her in the reshuffle, which will follow the next election, I would expect her to at least be elevated into the junior ministry. Don't ask me what portfolio, but she's certainly done nothing wrong. She hasn't been terribly upfront, but that's probably all to her advantage.
Further questions? Yes.
some Tony Abbott supporters supported.
No, I don't.
Sorry,
If they were Tony Abbott supporters, they were so bloody dumb in the first place that they're incapable of a conspiracy.
They supported
Turnbull.
That they voted for Turnbull.
They voted for Turnbull in the first round to create a two.
No, I
Not
don't.
copy out. Yeah.
No, I don't. The Abbott vote appears to have been fairly solid throughout, and I don't, those 35 Abbott voters were what his supporters said he had as firm votes to begin with. That was the Abbott vote. I don't think there are any more of them. I think that the Hockey lost all his votes because he became a maybe in a debate which was a yes-no debate. And that's so, you know, he didn't have any grounds to work on. I mean, I still feel sorry for Hockey. I mean, last week everybody was going around saying, "Oh, please, Joe, you're the only one who can save the party. Come to us, come to us." And he came to them and they pushed him off a cliff.
Hey, right at the back, Mark.
I was just wondering what's your take on Rudd appointing people like Nelson and Costello and Fisher to really high positions?
Did everyone hear the question?
Well, I think it's obviously caused a certain amount of angst in the Labor Party. I mean, I would not have elevated Costello to any position at all simply because I think he's such a lazy bastard. I mean, he wouldn't work in an iron lung. But I can see, but then I suppose on the board of the Futures Fund you don't have to do a lot of work. I can see the point. I mean, Rudd is determined to try and put himself above party politics. He's effectively overcome the faction system within his own party. The factions are still there, and they're often quite useful, but they're no longer the warlords and the bosses that they used to be. And I think Rudd's trying to extend that across the community as a whole, that he is determined to show that he is a Prime Minister above party politics. He's a Prime Minister for the national interest, blah, blah, blah. Now, he's going to ruffle a lot of feathers in doing it. And as I say, I think the appointment of Costello is probably a silly one. But you'll notice that there are a lot of Libs he hasn't offered a job to. And I don't think that, I can't see any problem with Nelson's job, for instance. I think he'll probably be quite good at it, probably no better than some Labor appointees would have been. And I think, that's where the problem's coming from, that there are a lot of Labor loyal and faithful servants who think they should have got the perk. But they didn't, so, that's Rudd's policy.
What can he offer Turnbull? What can he offer Turnbull?
Well, I think he'll stand for Pope.
Okay, we have one last question at the back. Thanks.
What is your assessment of the prospects for Tony Abbott as leader of the Liberal Party, his strengths and...
Yeah, I expected that to be the first question. So what are the prospects for the Liberal Party, the opposition, under Tony Abbott and Judy Bishop? We have an Abbott and a Bishop.
Well, the prospects are frankly dire. In a word, I mean, this is a retreat to the past. It's the worst possible retreat to the past because Abbott is one of Howard's great admirers. I mean, Abbott's talking about bringing back work choices. He's talking about bringing back temporary protection visas. He's a climate change denier. I mean, Abbott is Neanderthal in today's political terms, and he's also as mad as a tin full of worms, incidentally. I could tell you a few stories about Tony Abbott.
No. Unfortunately, for legal reasons, we're out of time. Before we get any stories about Tony Abbott, please thank Mungo while he makes...